A Loyalist feud refers to any of the sporadic feuds which have erupted almost routinely between Northern Ireland's various Loyalist paramilitary groups during and after the ethno-political conflict known as the Troubles broke out in the late 1960s. The feuds have frequently involved problems between and within the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force, as well as, later, the Loyalist Volunteer Force. Uda Uvf Feuds. Although the Uda and Uvf have frequently cooperated and generally coexisted, the two groups have clashed. Two particular feuds stood out for the bloody nature. A feud in the winter of 1974-75 broke out between the Uda and the Uvf, the two main Loyalist paramilitary organisations in Northern Ireland. The bad blood originated from an incident in the Ulster Workers' Council strike of May 1974 when the two groups were cooperating in support of the Ulster Workers' Council that support the Uda and Uvf members were giving involved shutting down their own social clubs and pubs due to complaints from Loyalist wives of the striking men. The reason for this was, with the men not working and funds being tight, the wives saw what little money they did have being spent at the pubs and social clubs controlled by Uda Uvf. Therefore the wives put pressure on the leaders of both groups to shut them down for the duration of the strike, and after consultation they agreed. All shut down except for a lone Uvf-affiliated pub on the Shankill Road. On a November night in 1974, a Uvf man named Joe Shaw visited the pub for a drink. While there, he was ribbed by the regulars about having allowed his local to be closed. A few pints later, Shaw and some friends returned to the local on North Queen Street and opened it up. Uda men patrolling the area had seen the pub's lights on and ordered Shaw and his friends to close the place down and go home. Shaw refused, and the Uda men left, but they returned a short while later with a shotgun, determined to close the pub down. In the brawl that developed, Shaw was fatally shot, and Lt. Bruce 1992 and GT, a joint statement, described it as a tragic accident, although a subsequent Uvf inquiry put the blame on Stephen Goatley and John Fulton, both Uda men. With antagonism grown, another man was killed in a drunken brawl on the 21st of February 1975, this time the Uda's Robert Thompson. This was followed by another pub fight in North Belfast in March, and this time the Uvf members returned armed and shot and killed both Goatley and Fulton, who had been involved in the earlier fight. The following month, Uda Colonel Hugh McVeigh and his aide David Douglas were the next to die, kidnapped by the Uvf on the Shankill Road and taken to Carrickfergus, where they were beaten before being killed near Island May. The Uda retaliated in East Belfast by attempting to kill Uvf leader Ken Gibson, who in turn ordered the Uda's headquarters in the east of the city to be blown up. Although this attack also failed, the feud rumbled on for several months in 1976, with a number of people, mostly Uda members, being killed before eventually the two groups came to an uneasy truce. Although the two organizations had worked together under the umbrella of the combined Loyalist Military Command, the body crumbled in 1997 and tensions simmered between West Belfast Uda Brigadier Johnny Adair, who had grown weary of the Northern Ireland peace process and the Good Friday Agreement, and the Uvf leadership. Adair by this time had forged close links with the dissident Lvf, a group which the Uvf had been on poor terms with since its foundation. Amidst an atmosphere of increasing tension in the area, Adair decided to host a Loyalist Day of Culture on the Shankill on Saturday, the 19th of August 2000, which saw thousands of Uda members from across Northern Ireland descend on his Lower Shankill stronghold. where a series of newly commissioned murals were officially unveiled on a day which also featured a huge Uda Uff parade and armed Uda Uff show of strength, unknown to the Uvf leadership, who had sought and been given assurances that no Lvf regalia would be displayed on the Shankill on the day of the procession, as well as the rest of the Uda outside of Adair's C Company. Adair had an Lvf flag delivered to the Lower Shankill on the morning of the celebrations, which he planned to have unfurled as the procession passed the Rex Bar, a Uvf horn, in order to antagonize the Uvf and try and drag it into conflict with as much of the Uda as possible. Adair waited until the bulk of the parade of Uda men had made its way up into the heart of the Shankill before initiating the provocative gesture. When it happened, skirmishes broke out between Uvf men who had been standing outside the Rex watching the procession and the group involved in unfurling the contentious flag, which had been discreetly concealed near the tail end of the parade. Prior to this, the atmosphere at the Rex had been jovial, with the Uvf spectators even joining in to sing Uda songs along to the tunes of the Uda-aligned flute bands which accompanied the approximately 10,000 Uda men on the parade up the Shankill Road. But vicious fighting ensued, with a roughly 300-strong C Company mob attacking the patrons of the Rex, initially with hand weapons such as bats and iron bars, before they shot up the bar as its patrons barricaded themselves inside. Also shot up was the Progressive Unionist Party headquarters, which faced the pub. C Company then went on the rampage in the Lower Shankill, attacking the houses of known Uvf members and the families, including the home of veteran Uvf leader Gusty Spence, and evicting the inhabitants at gunpoint as they wrecked and stole property and set fire to homes. By the end of the day, nearly all those with Uvf associations had been driven from the Lower Shankill. Later that night, C Company gunmen shot up the Rex again, this time from a passing car. While most of the Uda guests at Adair's carnival had duly left for home when it became apparent that he was using it to engineer violent conflict with the Uvf. Festivities nonetheless continued late into the night on the Lower Shankill, where Adair hosted an open-air rave party and fireworks display. The Uvf struck back on Monday morning, shooting dead two Adair associates, Jackie Coulter and Bobby Mahood, as they sat in a Range Rover on the Crumlin Road. The Uvf also shot up the Ulster Democratic Party headquarters on the Middle Shankill. An hour later, Adair's unit burned down the PUP's offices close to Agnes Street, the de facto border between the Uvf-dominated Middle and Upper Shankill and the Uda-dominated Lower Shankill. The Uvf responded by blowing up the UDP headquarters on the Middle Shankill. Adair was returned to prison by the Secretary of State on the 14th of September, although the feud continued with 4 more killed before the end of the year. Violence also spread to North Belfast, where members of the Uvf's Mount Vernon unit shot and killed a Uda member, David Greer, in the Tigers Bay area, sparking a series of killings in that part of the city. In another incident, the County Londonderry town of Coleraine saw tumult in the form of an attempted expulsion of Uvf members by Uda members, which was successfully resisted by the Uvf. But aside from these exceptions, Adair's attempt to ignite a full-scale war between the two organizations failed, as both the Uvf and Uda leaderships moved decisively to contain the trouble within the Shankill area, where hundreds of families had been displaced, and focused on dealing with its source as well as its containment. To Adair's indignation, even the A and B companies of his West Belfast brigade of the Uda declined to get involved in C Company's war with the Uvf. Eventually a ceasefire was reluctantly agreed upon by the majority of those involved in the feuding after new procedures were established with the aim of preventing the escalation of any future problems between the two organizations, and after consideration was paid to the advice of Gary McMichael and David Irvine, the then leaders of the two political wings of loyalism, Uvf Lvf Feuds. The nature of the LVF, which was founded by Billy Wright when he, along with the Portadown unit of the Uvf Mid-Ulster Brigade, was stood down by the Uvf leadership on the 2nd of August 1996 for breaking the ceasefire, has led to frequent battles between the two movements. This had come about when Wright's unit killed a Catholic taxi driver during the Drumcree standoff. Although Wright had been expelled from the Uvf, threatened with execution and an order to leave Northern Ireland, which he defied, the feud was largely contained during his life, and the two major eruptions came after his death. Simmering tensions boiled over in a December 1999 incident involving LVF members in Uvf Mid-Ulster Brigadier Richard Jameson and his men at the Portadown FC Social Club, in which the LVF supporters were severely beaten. The LVF members swore revenge, and on the 10th of January 2000 they took it by shooting Jameson dead on the outskirts of Portadown. The Uvf retaliated by killing two Protestant teenagers suspected of LVF membership and involvement in Jameson's death. As it turned out, the victims, Andrew Robb and David McIlwain, were not part of any loyalist paramilitary organization. The UDA's Johnny Adair supported the LVF and used the feud to stoke up the troubles that eventually flared in his feud with the Uvf later that year. Meanwhile, the Uvf attempted to kill the hitman responsible for Jameson, unsuccessfully, before the LVF struck again on the 26th of May, killing pup man Martin Taylor in Ballysallan. The LVF then linked up with Johnny Adair's C Company for a time as the feud with the Uvf took center stage. However, the Uvf saw fit to continue the battle in 2001, using its satellite group, the Red Hand Commando, to kill two of the LVF's leading figures, Adrian Porter and Stephen Warnock. Adair, however, convinced the LVF that the latter killing was the work of one of his rivals in the UDA, Jim Gray, who the LVF then unsuccessfully attempted to assassinate. In July 2005, the feud came to a conclusion as the Uvf made a final move against its rival organization. The resulting activity led to the deaths of at least 4 people, all associated with the LVF. As a result of these attacks, on the 30th of October 2005, the LVF announced that its units had been ordered to cease their activity and that it was disbanding. In February 2006, the Independent Monitoring Commission reported that this feud had come to an end. Uda Internal Feuds. The UDA, the largest of the Loyalist paramilitary groups, has seen a number of internal struggles within its history. From its beginnings, the UDA was racked by internal problems, and in 1972, the movement's first full year of existence, 3 members, Ingram Beckett, John Brown and Ernest Elliott, were killed by other UDA members. The main problems were between East Belfast chief Tommy Heron and Charles Harding Smith, his rival in the west of the city, over who controlled the movement. Although they had agreed to make compromise, candidate Andy Tyree the leader, each man considered himself the true leader. Heron was killed in September 1973 in an attack that remains unsolved. However, with confirmed in overall control of the UDA, Harding Smith initially remained silent until in 1974 he declared that the West Belfast Brigade of the movement was splitting from the mainstream UDA on the pretext of a visit to Libya organized by Tyree in a failed attempt to procure arms from Colonel Gaddafi. The trip had been roundly criticized by the Unionist establishment and raised cries that the UDA was adopting socialism. and Sir Harding-Smith used it to reignite his attempts to take charge. Harding-Smith survived 2 separate shootings but crucially lost the support of other leading Shankill Road UDA figures and eventually left Belfast, after being visited by North Belfast Brigadier Davy Payne, who warned him that he would not survive a third attack. South Belfast Brigadier John McMichael was killed by the Provisional IRA in December 1987, but it was later admitted that UDA member James Pratt Cray, a rival of McMichael's within the movement, had played a role in planning the murder. A new generation of leaders emerged at this time and decided that the woes facing the UDA, including a lack of arms and perceived poor leadership by aging brigadiers, were being caused by the continuing leadership of Andy Tyree. Tyree was forced to resign in March 1988 and the new men, most of whom had been trained up by McMichael, turned on some of the veterans whom Tyree had protected. Craig was killed, Tommy Little was declared persona non grata and various brigadiers were removed from office, with the likes of Jackie MacDonald, Joe English and Jim Gray taking the places. A second internal feud arose in 2002 when Johnny Adair and former politician John White were expelled from the UDA. Many members of the 2nd Battalion Shankill Road West Belfast Brigade, commonly known as C Company, stood by Adair and White, while the rest of the organisation were involved with attacks on these groups and vice versa. There were 4 murders, the first victim being a nephew of a leading loyalist opposed to Adair, Jonathan Stewart, killed at a party on the 26th of December 2002. Roy Green was killed in retaliation. The last victims were John Greg and Robert Carson, another loyalist. Adair's time as leader came to an end on the 6th of February 2003 when South Belfast Brigadier Jackie MacDonald led a force of around 100 men onto the Shankill to oust Adair, who promptly fled to England. Adair's former ally Mo Courtney, who had returned to the mainstream UDA immediately before the attack, was appointed the new West Belfast Brigadier, ending the feud. Uvf Internal Feuds. The feud between the Uvf and the Lvf began as an internal feud but quickly changed when Billy Wright established the Lvf as a separate organisation. Beyond this, the Uvf has largely avoided violent internal strife, with only 2 killings that can be described as being part of an internal feud taking place on Belfast's Shankill Road in late November 1975, with Archibald Waller and Noel Shaw being the 2 men killed. Several months prior to these killings, Mid-Ulster Brigadier Billy Hanna was shot dead outside his Lurgan home on the 27th of July 1975, allegedly by his successor, Robert Jackson. This killing, however, was not part of a feud but instead carried out as a form of internal discipline from within the Mid-Ulster Brigade.